It happened in the heart of Europe on a cold October morning in the year 732. A massive Muslim army, tens of thousands strong, swept across Europe like wildfire. One city after another fell in its path. Their armies had crushed kingdoms, crossed mountains, and now they were heading north, straight into the heart of Christian Europe. Only one man stood in their way: Charles Martel the Hammer. With just 30,000 Franks behind him, he faced an invasion that could reshape the map of the world. This was the Battle of Tours, a clash that shaped the very identity of Europe itself. Welcome to Heroic History, where we bring you the epic stories that shaped civilizations every single day. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of history lovers. So how did a small Frankish army stop one of the most powerful forces of its age? Was it luck, strategy, or divine timing? And why do historians still call this the battle that saved Europe? Let's start in the early 700s. Europe around the year 720 wasn't the knights and castles kind of medieval world we often imagine. It was something far more unstable, raw, and uncertain. The Western world was still in the long shadow of the Roman Empire's collapse, and the once mighty Frankish kingdom was beginning to tear itself apart from the inside. Local lords fought for their own power. Kings had become little more than figureheads, and the central authority, the kind that Rome once enforced so effectively, was basically gone. Kings. And among them, one figure began to stand out: Charles the Hammer. Charles wasn't born into a stable dynasty. He was the illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal. But what he lacked in legitimacy, he made up for in pure talent, political, military, and strategic. Around the early 700s, he held the title Mayor of the Palace, which at the time meant far more than being king. The Merovingian monarchs were still technically in charge, but everyone knew Charles was the real power behind the throne. He was the one making decisions, leading armies, and more importantly, holding the kingdom together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Between 718 and 731, Charles spent nearly 20 years doing something few leaders of his time could manage. He unified the fractured Frankish lands. In that span, he led 11 major campaigns to crush rebellions, secure loyalty, and build an army that could actually fight as one. That's like fighting a war almost every other year, all while rebuilding a country's political system at the same time. That may sound like just a number, but in the chaotic landscape of 8th century Europe, maintaining command over 11 major military operations meant something monumental: discipline, experience, and the loyalty of powerful nobles who had once fought each other instead of outsiders. It's no exaggeration to say that if Charles hadn't done this groundwork, there would have been no one capable of stopping the coming storm from the south. And that storm had a name: the Umayyad Caliphate. By the early 730s, the Umayyads had become one of the most powerful empires in the world, stretching from the edges of China in the east all the way to the Atlantic Ocean in the west. They had conquered North Africa, swept through Iberia, modern Spain, and Portugal, and established their European foothold at Narbona, known then as Arbuna. From there, they were only a few hundred miles away from the heart of what is now France. The man leading their northern campaign was Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, and a seasoned commander. His army's exact size is still debated, but modern estimates range from 20,000 to as many as 80,000 troops. An enormous force by the standards of early medieval Europe. And this wasn't a monolithic army either. It was a multicultural, multi-ethnic host. Arab veterans from Syria and Arabia, Persian infantry, Turkish mercenaries, and Berber cavalry from North Africa. Most of them were professional soldiers, heavily armed and well-trained, wearing chainmail armor, egg-shaped helmets, and armed with long lances and curved swords. But what exactly was Abd al-Rahman's goal? Historians still debate that. Was it a full-scale conquest of Gaul, a continuation of the great Islamic Futuhat, the expansion campaigns that had swept through 3 continents? Or was it just a large-scale raid meant to seize wealth, slaves, and prestige before returning south? Whatever his motives, the target was clear. The incredible wealth stored in the religious centers of Frankish Gaul, especially the Abbey of St. Martin at T. At the time, it was one of the most sacred and wealthy shrines in Western Europe, a place that symbolized both spiritual authority and immense material riches. Before Abd al-Rahman reached Tours, he met Duke Odo's army on the Garonne River near Bordeaux. What happened there was nothing short of a disaster for the Franks. The Umayyad cavalry crushed Odo's forces in a one-sided massacre. According to the Chronicle of 754, only God knows how many were slain. Odo's men were cut down as they fled, their lines shattered by armored horsemen moving with a speed and ferocity few European armies had ever seen. The road to the heart of Gaul now lay open, and this is where Charles Martel re-enters the picture. He understood something most of his contemporaries didn't. You couldn't face cavalry like that, with scattered levies and half-trained peasants. You needed discipline. You needed planning. You needed a single army that could absorb the shock and hit back. At this point in history, the Umayyads relied heavily on cavalry, fast, heavily armored riders who could move quickly and hit hard. Their whole battlefield philosophy was built around mobility and shock. When that kind of force charges, it doesn't just push enemies back, it crushes them. But Charles Martel realized something few others in his time fully grasped. To stop cavalry, you don't need more cavalry. You need infantry, steady, disciplined, professional foot soldiers who can absorb the hit and hold the line. That may sound obvious now, but back then it was revolutionary. Europe in the early 8th century didn't have standing armies. When a war broke out, kings and nobles would call up local levies, farmers with spears, a few knights, and maybe some hired mercenaries. They'd fight for a few weeks, then go home for the harvest. But Charles flipped that model upside down. He created a core force, a permanent professional army that made up roughly 80% of his total troops. These weren't just farmers with pitchforks, they were trained soldiers, drilled for discipline, hardened in battle, and loyal directly to him. But here's the catch, soldiers like that don't fight for free. A Frankish infantryman needed proper gear to survive a real battle. Not just a wooden spear and a leather cap. A good steel helmet, the Spangenhelm type, common in the 700s, cost around 6 solidi, about the same as 2 fine mares. A decent chain mail shirt, that was 12 solidi, which equaled about 12 healthy cows. Even a basic round shield and a good spear each cost about 2 solidi, or roughly 2 cows apiece. Multiply that by tens of thousands of soldiers, and you start to get the picture. Equipping 30,000 men wasn't just difficult, it was astronomical. Let's break that down in modern terms. If you think of one solid as the economic value of, say, one good work animal, imagine trying to buy 60,000 horses worth of equipment. Then remember, you also had to feed those men, pay them, and replace their gear when it broke. The logistics alone were staggering, so where did Martel get the money? Here's where things get controversial, even scandalous for the time. Charles Martel turned to one of the few sources of wealth still functioning in post-Roman Europe, the church. Monasteries and bishops owned enormous tracts of land, some of the best farmland in the Frankish world. They collected tithes, managed estates, and stored wealth in gold, grain, and livestock. To Martel, those resources looked less like sacred property and more like the key to survival. And so he took them. This policy became known later as Chinro, literally church robbery. But it wasn't a simple act of greed. It was, in Martel's eyes, a fiscal necessity. He confiscated church lands and repurposed them as benefices, grants of land given to his loyal followers. Those followers, in return, owed him military service. In other words, Church land was converted into a military paycheck. It was a clever system and also a dangerous one. On paper, Martel had essentially invented the financial foundation of medieval feudalism. Land in exchange for military obligation, but to the church it looked like blasphemy. Taking sacred land to fund war was shocking, even heretical. Still, the numbers made the logic hard to deny. Let's take a quick look at the financial breakdown for a single soldier. Now imagine scaling that up to 30,000 soldiers. That's thousands of helmets, shields, spears, and mail shirts. The math shows why the church's resources became irresistible. No other institution in the Frankish world had that kind of steady income. Martel's so-called blasphemous decision to seize church property gave him the one thing no one else had: a reliable, renewable stream of income that could sustain a standing army year after year. Those benefits lands didn't just feed soldiers, they created a professional military class loyal to him. Men who had land to defend, wages to earn, and discipline to maintain. The church, the very institution whose survival he arguably ensured, condemned him. Medieval chroniclers didn't mince words. They called him the first Frankish ruler to strip and separate the property of the churches from the churches themselves. That sense of outrage grew into legend. One of the most powerful stories came from Bishop Eucharius of Orleans, a man Charles had exiled for opposing his seizure of church lands. According to the tale, Eucharius had a terrifying vision. In it, he saw Charles Martel being tortured in the lowest pit of hell. The bishop said it plainly: Martel's punishment was for taking and dividing the property of the saints, meant for divine worship and for the nourishment of the servants of Christ and the poor. Whether you believe in the vision or not, you can see how deeply the scandal cut. In the church's moral universe, Martel had committed a crime against heaven. Now let's move to the battlefield itself. October 732. The leaves were turning in Gaul, and two very different worlds were about to collide. Charles Martel had marched south from Australia, moving his troops carefully and deliberately. He avoided the old Roman roads, which everyone expected him to use, and instead chose hidden routes that gave him the element of surprise. When the Umayyad commander Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi finally realized there was a Frankish army blocking his path to Tours, it was already too late to change course. At first, Abd al-Rahman didn't attack. For 6 days, both armies faced each other in a tense standoff. During that time, he called back his raiding parties, gathering all his men. And here's where the trouble began: all the loot they had collected. In theory, Islamic law said that 1/5 of all that plunder that comes belonged to the caliph. But in practice, soldiers kept whatever they could hold on to. That meant they now had something to lose. Historians now see that delay as a fatal mistake. The Umayyad army was built for speed and shock, not for sitting still. Every extra day of waiting turned their mobility into a burden. The treasure wagons and the piles of plunder they had gathered, gold, silver, slaves, livestock, became a logistical nightmare. What was supposed to symbolize victory now slowed them down, chained them to the ground. Meanwhile, Martel's army held firm. He had chosen his position carefully, a high ridge that forced any attacker to charge uphill. He deployed his men not in scattered bands, but in tight, disciplined ranks. These weren't ordinary levies, they were the very soldiers his blasphemous tax policies had paid for. Trained, equipped, and battle-hardened. Then finally the storm broke. The Umayyad cavalry, confident after crushing Odo of Aquitaine months earlier, expected another easy victory. They charged again and again, armored riders with curved swords and lances thundering up the slope. But this time, they met something new. The Franks didn't run. The Chronicle of 754 describes the moment vividly. The Franks stood immovable as a wall, firm as a glacier. Line after line of heavy cavalry smashed against them, but the Frankish infantry didn't break. They fought in tight formation, using their long spears to keep the horses at bay, and when they got close enough, stabbing upward to wound the mounts and unseat their riders. Imagine the noise, the pounding of hooves, the clash of steel on shields, the screams of wounded horses, and through it all, the Frankish line held. Arabic accounts confirm that the cavalry managed to break into the square formation several times, but they couldn't make it collapse. Every time a gap opened, the Franks closed ranks again. It was the kind of discipline that only comes from constant drilling and from soldiers who are not just loyal, but paid to fight and survive. That moment, the day infantry stopped cavalry, was something of a military miracle. In an era dominated by fast-moving horsemen, Charles Martel had built a force that could stand still under unimaginable pressure and turn that stability into strength. The decisive collapse began not because of some grand tactical failure or a clever trick by Charles Martel, but because of something more human: greed. During the thick of battle, word began to spread through the Umayyad ranks the Frankish army might be pushing toward their camp. Now, that camp wasn't just a bunch of tents and supplies. It was packed with treasure, piles of gold, silk, and all kinds of plunder taken from years of raiding through Aquitaine. For the Umayyad soldiers, that loot wasn't just booty. It was their personal reward, the very reason many of them had come north in the first place. Imagine thousands of heavily armed cavalrymen, men who'd ridden from as far as North Africa or Arabia, suddenly torn between duty and desire. Some probably thought, if I lose this, I lose everything. So they broke off, wheeled their horses around, and raced back toward camp, not realizing they were about to shatter the entire structure of their army. Abdal Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the Umayyad commander, made the fatal mistake of letting that distraction spiral out of control. His army's real goal, victory, became secondary to the lure of protecting their spoils. In that moment, discipline cracked. The chain of command, so crucial in any large force, began to unravel, and Charles Martel saw his chance. Up to this point, the Frankish line had held firm like a living fortress. Chroniclers described them as standing immovable like a glacier. Martel's men weren't fancy, mostly foot soldiers armed with long spears, trained to hold formation no matter what. They didn't chase or scatter. When the Umayyad cavalry surged forward, the Franks absorbed the shock, using the terrain and sheer discipline to stay locked together. Now, with the enemy in disarray, the Franks began pressing forward. In the chaos that followed, Abd al-Rahman was killed, probably cut down in close combat. Once their commander fell, the Umayyad army, a mix of Arabs, Berbers, and other groups from across the vast caliphate, lost any sense of coordination. The sources describe how surviving officers argued among themselves, unable to agree on a leader. Without central command, the retreat turned into a rout. By the next morning, the field near Tours was eerily quiet. The Franks, expecting another attack, held their ground, but when the sun rose, the Umayyad camp was abandoned. The invaders had fled in the night, leaving behind their dead, their tents, and even part of their precious treasure. It's tempting to imagine that moment as the saving of Europe. And for centuries, that's exactly how it was told. But when historians started digging into the records, they found a much more complicated story. Take the continuations of the Chronicle of Fredegar, for example, a text commissioned around 751, likely by the Carolingian family itself. It's pure political propaganda painting Charles Martel as the lone divinely inspired hero who, with the help of Christ, smashed the armies of Islam and protected St. Martin's shrine at Tours. That's the story that helped legitimize Martel's descendants, including Charlemagne, as the rightful rulers of a Christian Europe. But the Chronicle of 754, written by a Mozarabic Christian, that is a Christian living under Muslim rule in Iberia, gives a very different tone. It's less about divine intervention and more about tactics and human behavior. This chronicle is actually our most detailed account of the battle. It's also the first known Latin text to describe the victors as Europienses, Europeans. Think about that. In 754, someone was already using that word to describe a collective identity born not from politics or geography, but from the act of defending their faith and their homeland against an external threat. Then there are the Arabic sources written later by Muslim historians. They don't frame it as a world-changing defeat, but as a costly raid gone wrong, a logistical failure compounded by leadership disputes. From their perspective, the campaign wasn't meant to conquer all of Europe in the first place. The loss at Tours wasn't an apocalypse. It was an expensive mistake. When you line up all these sources side by side, the Carolingian Chronicle, the Mozarab account, and the later Arabic reports, you can see how each reflects the priorities and politics of its authors. Some historians like Edward Gibbon, you know, the guy who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, went as far as to call it one of the decisive battles of the world. In his view, if Charles Martel had lost that day in 732, the armies of Islam might have swept across Western Europe, possibly reshaping its religion, culture, and politics forever. Now, not everyone agrees with that dramatic take. Many modern historians have tried to tone it down, saying, hey, wait, the Umayyads weren't actually launching a full-scale invasion. This was more like a massive raid. And that's true to some extent. There's no evidence of a grand plan to conquer all of Europe. But even if it was a raid, the consequences went far beyond what either side could have imagined. Let's break down why this victory was still absolutely decisive. Not just in a military sense, but in shaping the political and religious landscape of Europe. First, it confirmed Frankish dominance over Gaul. Before this, the Frankish kingdom under Charles Martel was still consolidating power, competing with other local lords and facing external threats. But after Tours, there was no more doubt. The Franks were the undisputed military masters of Western Europe. The victory turned Martel from a powerful duke into a near-mythic figure, the man who stopped the tide. Second, it halted the northern expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate. Up until that point, the Muslim armies had advanced incredibly fast, conquering all of North Africa, sweeping through the Iberian Peninsula, and even crossing the Pyrenees into modern-day France. But after 732, that momentum stopped cold. Sure, smaller raids continued for decades, but the grand wave of expansion, the one that had carried Islam from Arabia to the Atlantic in barely a century, had reached its high watermark. Third, the battle laid the groundwork for an entirely new dynasty. The wealth that Martel seized from church lands, the Kirchchin Rob, or church robbery as his critics called it, became the financial backbone of his reforms. Those funds allowed him to build a permanent professional army, something rare in early medieval Europe. Without that, his son, Pen the Short, could never have taken the throne, and his grandson Charlemagne would never have built the Carolian Empire. The empire that later became the foundation of what we think of as medieval Christendom. And fourth, it safeguarded Christianity in Western Europe at a time when everything was up for grabs. Remember, in the early 700s, Islam wasn't just another religion on the rise. It was the dominant force of the century. Within 100 years of its founding, the Islamic Caliphate had replaced the old Persian Empire, stripped away most of the Byzantine territories, and ruled from Spain all the way to India. So the Franks' victory at Tours didn't just stop an army. It symbolized the survival of an entire cultural and spiritual identity. When you put all that together, you start to see why people have called this a turning point. Even if the immediate battle itself wasn't massive by later standards. But here's the paradox that makes this story so fascinating. That very act, the so-called Kirchchin Rob, the sacrilegious robbery, was precisely what allowed Charles to save Christian Europe. The same resources that church leaders said belonged to God were what fed, armed, and paid the soldiers who would stop the Muslim advance at Tea. It's one of those moments in history that makes you pause. What's holier, defending the faith or obeying the church? Martel's choice reshaped that question forever. In the short term, it brought him condemnation. But in the long run, the same blasphemous funds that bought Martel's army also bought Europe time. Time to rebuild, to centralize power, and to evolve into something more unified. From those roots grew the Carolian dynasty, which reshaped Europe under Charlemagne's schools, law codes, cathedrals, and all. So in a strange twist of fate, the survival of Western Christendom was secured not by saints or miracles, but by one man's willingness to defy the church itself. Thanks for sticking with me through this incredible story. If you found it as fascinating as I did, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Battle of Tours really saved Europe? Or was that just good storytelling by later historians? Share this with a friend who loves history. Hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep diving into stories like this one every day. See you in the next video.